welcome back to IDP Plus Trends. On this episode, we're going to dig into the Week 15 fantasy playoffs, IDP rankings for defensive lineman, linebacker, and defensive back, top 15 at each position. Right now, I'm going to start sharing my screen so you can see the rankings as I go. To all those, real quickly, who are subscribed already, I appreciate you from the bottom of my heart. If you would like to become a subscriber to IDP Plus, you can go right to the subscription page at idpplus.com/membership and use the promo code PROPS to get 20% off of your subscription today. So when you are on the IDP Plus homepage here, you're just going to go over rankings, and we're going to take a look at defensive linemen first. So I'm going to go over to weekly defensive linemen. Even though it is fantasy playoffs, our site does run through the playoffs. We will have rankings all the way up until week, I believe, 18. So these defensive lineman rankings here are brought to you by, as always, Justin Fry on Twitter at JFryDP, JFRYEDP. As always, Justin, appreciate you getting me these rankings, man. And we're going to dive right into what you got. Starting off with Pittsburgh's own number 1, TJ Watt. Number 2, Myles Garett. Number 3, Max Crosby. Number 4, Micah Parsons. Number 5, Will Anderson Jr. Number 6, Andrew Van Ginkel. Number 7, Nick Bosa. Number 8, Jonathan Grenard. Number 9, Trey Hendrickson. 10, Danielle Hunter. Number 11, Josh Hines Allen. Number 12, Mohamoud Diabate. 13, Greg Russo. 14, Jared Verse. And 15, finally, Brian Burns. So looking at this list here, I see a lot of chalk. I see a lot of, big names up front. Of course, we lost Aiden Hutchinson for the year. We did get Nick Bosa back, so he cracked the top 8. But, yeah, I mean, if you had to predict from week 1 what your top 8, top 10 would look like at this point in the season, this is just about where the season began, maybe minus Andrew Van Ginkel. What a surprise he's been. But TJ Watt to start us off at number 1. TJ Watt this week gets Philly. Last week he played Cleveland in a good matchup but did not excel. He had 4 – at this point it's TJ Watt. We're going to say he just had 4 tackles, a tackle for loss in that matchup versus Cleveland. Now, week 15, he's going to get Philadelphia, a great matchup. Third most tackles allowed to the defensive lineman position this season with 19.5. So it's a great matchup for TJ Watt. Jalen Hurts, furthermore, has been sacked 4 times by Carolina last week in week 14. So you've got a good tackle matchup here for TJ Watt. Jalen Hurts, even though the offense looks good, he's still getting sacked 4 times by Carolina last week. Let's see if Alex Highsmith can help bring pressure along TJ Watt, help TJ get off the edge and get to Jalen Hurts. But overall, great matchup. And TJ Watt, even though he had a down week, even 2 weeks, those 2 matchups versus Cleveland, you still, if you have him, it is playoff time. It's not time to get cute. You're still rolling him out, whether he's number 1 or number 3 in your rankings. Number 2, Myles Garett. Last week versus Pittsburgh, 3 tackles, a sack, a fumble recovered. And again, he looked better than his counterpart on the other side of the ball, Pittsburgh's own TJ Watt. So Myles Garett, a hand toss with these 2, coin flip, who gets 1, who gets 2. But week 15, Myles Garrett's going to go up against Kansas City, who allows, again, a good matchup, the 4th most tackles to defensive linemen with 19 per game on average. This game is going to be in Cleveland, so I do expect the game to be nasty, even though it's a great team like Kansas City. You come and play the AFC North. You come to Cleveland. We saw the snow that was here versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. I'm not sure if it's going to be snowing like that for this game, but take Patrick Mahomes and company out of Chiefs Stadium, and I think this is a good recipe here for Myles Garett. Good, tackle potential here with the fourth most tackles let up to defensive linemen, and I think he's got a good chance to get a sack. So Myles Garett got one last week. Let's see if he can keep rolling versus the Chiefs this week. Number 3, Max Crosby. is actually questionable for this game, and truly questionable. A lot of beat writers think he's actually going to be out. Maybe this isn't a re-aggravation of the knee injury he had before. But as it stands, last week versus Tampa Bay, he had 2 total tackles, a tackle for loss, and a pass defense. And Max Crosby, even though he's coming at number 3 here, again, this is kind of based off like the potential. We know Max Crosby over the last couple of years who he has. He hasn't been that same player. But he does get a better matchup versus Atlanta, who are allowing 15.5 and 20.7 tackles per game over the last 3. So even though Atlanta looks like a bad matchup on paper, it's actually been pretty juicy. They've been a decent matchup, but then juicy over the last 3. So Max Crosby, if he can play in this game, maybe he can rack up some more tackles. It doesn't look like this is going to be a great matchup for him to get another sack. Kirk Cousins only sacked twice over the last 2 games. So Max Crosby, a little bit of red flag on this one, but as always, high upside, high risk, high reward play. Moving on, Micah Parsons, big donut last week, was held off the box score versus Cincinnati. Only played 75 snaps, so snap counts were a little bit down. Cincinnati was a bad matchup as it stood, only giving up 11.8 tackles per game to defensive linemen, which is actually dead worst in the league. So maybe we'll throw a little asterisk next to Micah Parsons there. But hey, guess what? This week it doesn't get much better versus Carolina. They're only giving up 13.8 tackles per game to the defensive linemen. And maybe if we're talking about, someone like Will Anderson Jr., who's next on this list, we're not going to really put too much weight on the tackles. That's not their kind of forte. But with Micah Parsons, that is a big part of his, his calling card here in IDP is getting the tackles as well as the sacks. Bryce Young has only been sacked 4 times in the last 3 games combined. So this is going to be a tough one for Micah Parsons. Justin, I get you for putting Parsons here. This is probably the game he has 2 sacks and throw it out the window. But the odds are kind of against Micah Parsons this week. Plus, you have a bad taste in your mouth with that 0. But again, you didn't draft Micah Parsons to sit him in the playoffs. So let's hopefully he can return to his safe floor ways here in Week 15. Number 5 is going to be the aforementioned Will Anderson Jr. versus Miami. He got a bye in Week 14, but if we look 2 weeks ago, back to the last game he played, Week 13 versus Jacksonville, he had a donut as well in that game 2 weeks ago. But even though we have a bad taste in our mouth, if we look back versus Week 4 in Jacksonville, that's who his opponent's going to be this week. Will Anderson only had 2 tackles and no sacks. So for me, a little bit of a bad history here with Will Anderson Jr. I get it; he's a walking bomb. In this matchup with Miami, Tua has only been sacked 18 times in 9 games played, so just an average of 2 a game. As a matter of fact, one of those games for Tua was Thanksgiving versus the Packers. He was sacked 5 times in that one game, so that makes this stat look even worse for Will Anderson Jr. Last week, Tua was not sacked by the Jets in Week 14. But keep in mind, even though all that's stacked against him, Will Anderson Jr., of course, is still a walking bomb. He has 9.5 sacks, tremendous on the season. And actually, all those sacks have only come in 6 games. So, he's had games with 3 sacks, 2 sacks, 1.5 sacks, all the way down to 1 sack. So, Will Anderson can get him in bunches, and that's why Justin got him up so high. Again, you're not going to draft Will Anderson and sit him in the playoffs, so we're hoping to break the mold here. Number 6, rolling with steam, Andrew Van Ginkel. He had 3 tackles and a pass defense in week 14 versus Atlanta, which was a good matchup for him. But he's going to get Chicago in Week 15, the 3rd worst matchup to defensive linemen when it comes to tackles. And again, this is holding weight here on Van Ginkel because he is a tackle getter. He's averaging right around 5 tackles per game. So that is a big part of his game. So that's not looking good. But you're obviously the first thing you think of when you think of Chicago is you're going to remember Caleb Williams leads the league with 56 sacks in 13 games. That is an average of 4.31. Believe minus Jameis Winston, that is the highest average. But, he's played many more games and absolutely leads the league with sacks. So, even though this is going to be a tough game for Van Ginkel, looks like to rack up the tackles, he is playing the quarterback who's been sacked over 4 times a game. So Van Ginkel, pencil him as a top 8 play. You could even make the case for top 5 just based on, how solid he's been, solid of a floor. So Andrew Van Ginkel, great play. Has only finished under 3 tackles in 2 games. And if you want one more, 6 out of 13 games, almost half of the games, he's had 5 or more tackles. So yeah, he's averaging 4.8 tackles per game. He's had a total of 62 and 13 games played, with 9 sacks, 5 passes defensed, 2 interceptions, a forced fumble, an interception. Sorry, 2 interceptions, forced fumble, and 2 touchdowns. So again, when we look at the defensive lineman position, this is a unique player. Yeah, you have some Micah Parsons, you have some TJ Watts players that can get the tackles, the splash plays, the sacks. But Van Ginkel is seemingly to have the safest tackle floor out of them all, kind of playing that hybrid role as a linebacker there. Maybe because, Ivan Pace Jr. is on IR. It helps him out a little bit. I know it's helped Josh Metellus there in the backfield. So Van Ginkel, like him a lot, even though, when we're looking at the matchup, it looks bad on paper. Still, he's going to sack Caleb Williams. Book it, week 15. All right, number 7, Nick Bosa. Already played, had an underwhelming game, 2 tackles in his. 4 tackles and no sacks in his return versus the Rams this past week. Moving on, number 8, Jonathan Grenard back to the Minnesota Vikings. Jonathan Grenard, you're certainly not going to bench this guy, even though he burned you last week with just 2 tackles versus Atlanta. Over this last 4 games, Jonathan Grenard has had 17 tackles, 3 sacks, 6 tackles for loss, and 2 forced fumbles. So almost averaging a little bit more than 4 tackles a game. Almost has a sack a game, 3/4 of a sack a game, more than a tackle for loss, and half a forced fumble. That's an average for those 4 games. So he's been on a heater, absolute tear. Again, he's got Caleb Williams to go against this week. The closest quarterback to Caleb Williams in sacks allowed. So Caleb Williams, I think, has we said 56. The closest quarterback to Caleb Williams is C.J. Stroud with 41 sacks. Guess what? Jonathan Grenard in week 3 sacked C.J. Stroud 3 times. So, that was a susceptible matchup. This is the most susceptible matchup. Let's see if Jonathan Grenard can get it done again. Him and Van Ginkel, both top 8 plays. Moving on, we got number 9, Trey Hendrickson, sack leader around the NFL. Last week, 1 tackle on 1 sack versus Dallas. So save the day if you're in a sack-heavy league. He gets a middle-of-the-road matchup versus Tennessee in Week 15. Tennessee allows 15.2 points tackles per game to the defensive linemen. But keep in mind, this is a Tennessee offense that has allowed Will Levis to get sacked 17 times the last 4 games. So that's an average higher than 4 a game. He's looking like Caleb Williams out there. Will Levis is. Get him some help. But yeah, 12.5 sacks in only 7 games played. I'm sorry, in 7 games. If you look at the games where Trey Hendrickson has gotten sacks, only 7 of them, but he has a combined 12.5. So again, another player, even though he's played 13 games, he's a walking bomb. He can get multiple sacks in a game, and that's why you're playing Trey Hendrickson, and that's why he's sitting in the top 10, even though he has a low tackle floor. Number 11 here is going to be Danielle Hunter. Last week, he had a Week 14 bye. If we look one more week, Week 13 versus Jacksonville, he only had 1 tackle. But the last 4 collectively, he's had 18 tackles, 5 sacks, 8 tackles for loss, and a pass defense. So Danielle Hunter averaging over a sack in the last 4 games with over 4 tackles. Tremendous upside, tremendous floor. Keep Danielle Hunter pegged in your lineup. Hopefully he eats this week. He's got a mid to bottom tier matchup versus Miami. Tua has only been sacked, again, 9 times in his last 4 games, and 5 of those were versus Green Bay on Thanksgiving. So really, in those last 3 games, if you take away those 5 sacks out of the 9, you're only left with 4 sacks in 3 games. That's not a good average. Not likely to get sacked. Jets could not get a sack on Tua last week in Week 14. Let's see if Houston can break the mold. Houston's got a great defensive line. I expect Danielle Hunter to have a good game, whether it be through the tackles or getting a sack, maybe multiple. Another guy who can get multiple sacks in the games. He's done it. So let's see if Danielle Hunter can keep looking like he did last year with Minnesota in Houston. Moving on, number 11, just outside the top 10, is Josh Hines Allen for Jacksonville. Last week he had 2 tackles, a sack, 2 tackles for loss, and a forced fumble. Big game by him. Week 15, he gets the Jets, who are allowing 16 tackles to defensive linemen. That is actually in the last 3 games, 16 tackles to defensive linemen. So they've actually been a better matchup, the Jets have, than they have been for the majority of the season over the last 3. Aaron Rodgers, listen, he's banged up right now. We know that Breece Hall may not play in this game. Rodgers has multiple injuries. Versus Miami last week, he was sacked 3 times, so it's a good chance that they're able to get to Aaron Rodgers multiple times here this week. Back-to-back games for Josh Allen Hines with sacks, and he's trending up in a good matchup here. And I think that's most important, that Josh Hines Allen has had those back-to-back sacks. He's looked good. He's got a forced fumble, tackles for loss. It's all clicking now. So the last 2 weeks, I don't think have been a fluke. I think he's been in a shell of what we saw last week. Continue to roll him out as a top 12 play this week. Moving on, number 12, our cheat code here, defensive lineman, really playing the linebacker position, and no JOK back this week, so everything looks A-OK for Mohamed Diabate from Cleveland. He had 7 tackles and a tackle for loss last week versus Pittsburgh in a juicy matchup. Played 83% of snaps, and actually over the last 4 games, that was the highest snap percentage he's had. Devin Bush continues to trend down, playing lower snap counts every week. Last week it was down to 46 compared to Diabate's 83. Again, no JOK, so we don't have to worry about that. It looks like Diabate is we can pencil him in for at least 83, 85% snaps. Anything we get more than that is a little bonus. Keep in mind, he's not a defensive lineman everywhere, so he might not be available in your league, but this is a guy where, if you're playing for sacks, if you're starting defensive lineman for sacks, you're not really looking Diabate's way. He hasn't done that this year. He is a little bit of a hybrid player. I'm surprised he hasn't had a sack yet. Maybe he's just not playing that role. Maybe when JOK comes back, he will. But the tackles are surely going to go down, and so are the snaps. So enjoy it while it lasts, while JOK is not back versus Kansas City. Understand that with Mohamed Diabate, you're not going to have, assume you're not going to have a chance for a sack. But as a defensive lineman, not many guys have a tackle floor like Diabate. So last week he went 2 solos, 5 assists for those 7 tackles. Maybe this week it's 5 solos and 2 assists, and that's a big difference in your scoring. So Diabate, solid tackle floor there on him versus Kansas City. Number 13, Greg Rousseau. I got a little red flag on Greg Rousseau here. He's been great. He's a walking bomb. Last week, though, he only had 1 tackle, no sacks, and a bad matchup versus the Rams. This week, he's going to get Detroit, who allow the 4th most tackles to defensive linemen. So that sounds great. The only problem with that is Greg Rousseau only averages 3.2 tackles per game. It's not really his game getting those tackles. This is a guy you're going to bank on the sacks. 1 double-digit performance as far as points output. He's had 10 or more points 1 game that he hasn't had a sack. So if he doesn't get that sack, he's probably not going to have double digits. Now the big kicker is he's playing Detroit this week. Jared Goff has been sacked only 5 times in the last 4 games and only 23 times in the 13 games played. So not even an average of 2 sacks a game the Lions allow. Metrics not looking good here for Greg Rousseau. He's going to need a sack to save your day. If you have a better option, someone your gut's telling you to go with, I'd roll him out. Greg Rousseau maybe gets a sack in this game, maybe has a high floor. Just to me, all the cards are looking against him. Number 14, Jared Verse played versus San Francisco. Only had 2 tackles. Things didn't really go so well for him. Wasn't really a great game script. A lot of players did not do well in that game, besides Fred Warner, brought back to life on that one. Moving on, finally, for our last top 15 defensive lineman here is Brian Burns from the Giants. He's going to play the Baltimore Ravens this week. But last week versus New Orleans, Brian Burns had 4 tackles, a sack, and a forced fumble. So a monster game for him there. If you're in a league where you get 6 or 7 points for a sack, that's a huge game for Brian Burns. It was nice to see. It's been a while since he had one of those, but high potential is always there. He's got a matchup versus Baltimore this week, who allow the 10th most tackles to defensive linemen. So he is a tackle output kind of guy. Of course, getting sacks is a priority for Burns too, but that's going to be tough. Lamar Jackson's only been sacked 6 times over the last 4 games and 19 times only in 13 games. So again, not averaging 2, just barely over 1 sack a game for Lamar Jackson. So if you're banking on a sack for Brian Burns, it's it's going to be a little bit tough to get. But if you're looking for replacements, I have some honorable mentions as always. Some guys that this is not my list. I can't tell you how far they are out of the top 15, but 3 guys that I like this week. If you're maybe in a deeper league, they might be out there. You might be, having a little conversation with yourself whether to start these guys. But I really like first guy is Cam Hayward versus Philly this week. We get a keystone matchup, Philly versus Pittsburgh. He's got a top 3 matchup versus Philadelphia as far as tackles goes. He's had 5+ tackles the last 3 games, and actually back-to-back games with sacks now. So Cam Hayward, like him to get 5 tackles or more in this game, be a steady defensive lineman play for you if you're really not about banking for the sack. Next, if you are looking for a sack, maybe look at Nick Benito versus Indianapolis this week. It's a top 10 matchup. He's had a sack in the last 4 games and 14 tackles, and of course a return touchdown last week. Last but not least, I'm sorry, I got 2 more. I got excited with defensive linemen this week. Next is Zach Sealer versus Houston. Listen, this is a bottom 8 matchup. Metrics don't add up, but you look at Zach Sealer's box score the last 4 games, 16 tackles, 4 sacks. That's a nice clean average of 4 tackles and a sack per game. So Zach Sealer, albeit a rough matchup. Let's see if you can keep lightning striking here. And finally, from Pittsburgh, going back to this game versus Philly, the Keystone Classic, we got Alex Highsmith, top 3 matchup against Philly as far as tackles go. Last week, his return to the lineup, 3 tackles and a sack. So I like Alex Highsmith. I mean, he has a great opportunity to get not only a great amount of tackles here, but also a sack. Hopefully him or TJ Watt or the both of them can. So like those 4 guys as streamers. Right now, I'm going to switch over to my linebacker rankings. So once again, going over weekly rankings down to LB. And we are going to talk some top 15 linebackers, and they're juicy. We got all teams off by this week, 6 teams back. So looking at the top 15, number 1, I have Zack Baun. Number 1 I had last week, but number 2 this week, Ernest Jones. Number 3, Jamien Sherwood. Number 4, Zaire Franklin. Number 5, Nakobe Dean. Number 6, Jermaine Pratt. Number 7, Eric Kendricks. Number 8, Roquan Smith. Number 9, EJ Speed. Number 10, Quay Walker. 11, Daiyan Henley. 12, Josie Jewell. 13, Robert Spillane. 14, Jordan Brooks. And 15, Bobby Wagner. So to start this list off, let's take a look at number 1. That is Zack Baun. He had 11 tackles and a sack week 14 last week. Bad matchup versus Carolina over the last 4 weeks. Only Christian Roseboom has had more tackles than Baun's 42. So averaging over 10 tackles the last 4 weeks. He gets a bad matchup last week. Talked a little bit about him on my betting show. When we're looking at prop bets, tackles, I think his line was at 9.5. I said take the over still. He's excelled in bad matchups. He went and had 11 tackles. Boy, get this man a good matchup. Well, he's going to run into it this week versus Pittsburgh. Our best matchup you could ask for, most allowed points to the tackles to the linebacker with 20.2 a game. 129 tackles in 13 games for Baun, so he's just 1 tackle under averaging 10. Again, he now gets the best matchup he could ask for 11 tackles and a sack in a bad matchup. Lord, watch out when this guy comes plays Pittsburgh this week. So Zack Baun, easily my number one here. Money in the bank. Don't get cute. Zack Baun, all you got to do is pencil him in. He's looking like Luke Kuechly out there this year. So moving on to number 2, Ernest Jones. I had mentioned I had him as my number 1 last week. We're looking for dependability, and that's exactly what he gives. He had 8 tackles, an interception, and a pass defense versus Arizona in a great matchup. They actually allowed the second most tackles to linebackers, which is a big part of why I had him at number 1. This week 15, he's going to get Green Bay, which is a middle to bottom tier matchup. It's going to be in Seattle. It's going to be home for Ernest Jones. Keep in mind, he's had 8 or more tackles in the last 6 games, and 2 of those have been bad matchups. So I think Ernest Jones, when you look at a guy who is a banger, he's the top linebacker on their team. I can pencil him in for a safe 8 to 10 tackles here. And I think, as long as you have Ernest Jones in your lineup, you get those 8-10 tackles. It doesn't matter whether he's your number 2 ranked, number 5. If they're this high, pencil him in. Ernest Jones is a great play this week versus Green Bay. And if we're looking at the history, I look back a few weeks versus Green Bay. I'm saying like, hey, what are the most recent opponents the top linebackers do against them? Jack Campbell last week had 8 tackles against Green Bay, and Jordan Brooks 2 weeks ago had 9 tackles against Green Bay. So Ernest Jones, I think, is a higher volume tackler than both of these guys. So I expect Ernest Jones to have at least 8 or 9 tackles like these two guys did. Number 3, Jamien Sherwood has been a revelation this season, looking like a Zaire Franklin type of player out there. Came out of nowhere, 18 tackles and 2 tackles for loss versus Miami in Week 14. Yeah, this guy's going to be bumped up the rankings in my book. He's had 45 tackles over the last 4 games, probably highest average. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I believe that's the highest average over the last 4 games. One of those games, believe it or not, he had 4 tackles. So really, we're looking at 42 tackles in 3 games, which is insane. So even though that was a last 4 game stat, again, one of those games was 4. So 45 tackles in the last 4 games, crazy stat. Anyhow, he's had 10 or more tackles in 6 games. Only 2 tackles have been less than 4. So I get it. He has a kind of a lower floor, maybe than like the next guy. Zaire Franklin, maybe lower floor than Nakobe Dean, but the upside, he's had, like I said, 6 double-digit tackle games, and these are not, all 11 or 12 games. Yeah, he had 1 game, 11 tackles, 2 games, 12 tackles, a 13 tackle game, a 17 tackle game. Now he rips off an 18 tackle game. Like Jamien Sherwood is Zaire Franklin as a rookie, so whether it's Franklin or Sherwood here at the number 3 spot, it doesn't matter. Pencil both of these guys in. Jamien Sherwood, absolute walking bomb. Quincy Williams, sure, is still there, but C.J. Mosley's not coming back. I love Sherwood the rest of the season, even in a rough matchup. But Tank Bigsby toted the rock 18 times last week. We have no Evan Ingram. He's out the year. So I think they're going to run heavy on the run game in Jacksonville, and that's a great thing for Sherwood. So matchup proof. If you have him, you're starting him. Simple as that. Same thing with the next guy, number 4, Zaire Franklin. Last game, of course, Week 14 he was on bye, but Week 13 versus New England, 12 tackles, 1.5 sacks, a forced fumble, pass defense. He did it all. Vintage Zaire Franklin. Last 2 games, 25 tackles, 2.5 sacks, a forced fumble, a pass defense. The only problem with Zaire Franklin, why he's ranked 4 and not 2 or 3, is because he's playing Denver, and Denver allows under 15 total tackles to the linebacker position as a whole. So I mean, 2 dogs got to eat here, him and EJ Speed, and you're telling me they're going to get 15 tackles between the both of them. That's a little bit discouraging. It's a bad matchup, but again, Zaire Franklin, if you have him, you're starting him. He's shown to be solid, to be competent in bad matchups. But actually, Zaire Franklin, he's somebody who's very linear, very, very, very correlative when it comes to looking at matchups. If he has a great matchup versus Pittsburgh, he's going to ball. If he has a middle of the matchup, expect the production to, fall down. If he has a bad matchup, chances are when you look back at his games played, the bad matchups he's had this year, he hasn't excelled. He's had a safe floor, 10 points, but he hasn't excelled. So expect to get 10, hope to get 25, and aim somewhere in between. And Zaire Franklin, if you have him, you can't sit him. 25 tackles over those last 2 games. So, on a big heater right now. Still had 135 tackles in 13 games, an average of over 10. Must start still. Number 5, somebody who I think I'm higher on in my rankings than other consensus is Nakobe Dean. I'm not sure why. I think Nakobe Dean has absolutely proved it. I ragged on him earlier in the year. I'll admit it. I'm a man. But last week, the play that he's come to show us, looking at last week, 12 tackles versus Carolina in a bad matchup. I mean, both of these guys, him and Baun, are top 5 plays in my eyes. He's going to get the number 1 matchup again versus Pittsburgh, allowing over 20 tackles to the linebackers. Only 3 linebackers have more tackles over the last 4 games than Nakobe Dean. Now, number 1 is his teammate, Zack Baun, who I'd mentioned already. Number 2, Christian Roseboom. Number 3, the third one, is Eric Kendricks. So Nakobe Dean, 40 tackles over the last 4 games and a clean average of 10. He's in great company there with Roseboom, Baun, and Kendricks. He's had double-digit tackles in 3 out of the 4 top 10 matchups so far. Here's to making it 4 out of 5, which I expect Nakobe to do. I would not be surprised if Nakobe Dean and Zack Baun both had 10 or more tackles this week. Number 6, we're moving down to Jermaine Pratt, somebody who climbs up the rankings heavy in part of Logan Wilson being out on IR. We got a little taste of what life was going to look like without Logan last week. Jermaine Pratt, 7 tackles, a tackle for loss, and a pass defense. Looked very strong versus Dallas. I think he's a top 20 linebacker now moving forward. Of course, I have him here as number 6. He's been up producing like that earlier on in the year before he fell off. Week 15, he's going to get Tennessee, a top 15 matchup. So to me, I think Jermaine Pratt, he's a safe play. Him and Akeem Davis Gaither is a solid play. Obviously not on this top 15 list, but I like them both. Good matchup versus Tennessee. Tennessee last week gave up 11 tackles to Foye himself. I believe Devin Lloyd and Ventrell Miller sprinkled in for about 10 each. So, again, that was a matchup where they actually let up more than 20 tackles. Keep in mind here, this is an important feature here with this game. Tony Pollard is questionable to play in this game. Keep an eye on that active and inactive list, because if Tony Pollard is out, I do not see Tennessee being able to run the ball as efficiently, as often as they have been. So, Jermaine Pratt, assuming Tony Pollard is in there, yeah, I'm sticking him at 6. Assuming he's not, maybe I drop him to 15, probably no higher than 15. But yeah, Jermaine Pratt, as it stands right now, is a solid play. Listen, don't chase the stars right now. This is not the time to play around. Jermaine Pratt's going to get you 10 to 15 points. Take it and move on. Forget about it. That's all you need in the playoffs. Don't get cute. Number 7, Eric Kendricks. 12 tackles last week and a tackle for loss versus Cincinnati. Week 15, he's going to play Carolina, which is, in my opinion, about an even matchup as far as tackles per game goes. Both Cincy and Carolina allowed 14.7 tackles per game to the linebacker over the last 3 games. So the last 3 have looked similar. Carolina on the season has been a little bit of a worse matchup than Cincinnati, but over the last 3, they've been dead even. Big kicker here for Eric Kendricks is, let's see what life is like without no DeMarvion Overshown. Is he going to have more opportunities for tackles, more responsibilities? I'm looking at this situation too. I don't know what to make of it. We haven't seen a game yet, but being inquisitive, you look at the guy who took over for Overshown, Maris Leofau, rookie, played 32% of snaps. Did have a sack, great for him. But what's more important when I look at the box score? I want to see how many tackles he's had in that 32%. And that was only 2 tackles. So let's say 32%. It's almost 33. We can just multiply it times 3 to get to 100%. Multiply his 2 tackles times 3. Wow. Leofau is going to only take 6 tackles away a game from Kendricks. That's a lot less tackles a game taken away than when Overshown was there. So, yeah, I'm a little bit optimistic here. Carolina historically this year is a bad matchup, but again, over the last three, they've been just about a top 12 matchup. So Bryce Young and company maybe making the offense look a little bit better as a byproduct of it. But as for Eric Kendricks owners, we're happy because this is a good recipe here, a good matchup going into the playoffs when we need it. And Eric Kendricks has been dependable. You can just pencil him in for over 8 tackles. And I don't expect that any negative result from Overshone being out. I expect him just to sap up more tackles, if anything. So Eric Kendricks, keep rolling him out there in your playoff matchups. Number 8, Roquan Smith. I'm a lot lower than consensus here. I'll tell you why in a second. But Roquan Smith, great game, returning from injury, 11 tackles and a half a sack, week 13, in a cake matchup versus Philly, albeit played 100% snaps, so there was no concern about health there. But guess what, Roquan? You're not in Philly anymore. You're playing the Giants, who are allowing under 15 total tackles per game over the last 3 games. Tim Boyle, I believe that's who's starting this game. Are they able to? Is New York able to sustain drives? Are they able to run it with Tyrone Tracy so often if they're down in the game? If they can't sustain drives, get a first. I just don't like this recipe, this game script. I'm trying to play this game in my head, and I just see Baltimore with the ball. I don't even know what life's going to look like with Tim Boyle as the quarterback of the Giants. So I definitely expect that to hurt all of Baltimore's IDP players. So Roquan, Kyle Hamilton, I'll talk a little bit about him later. I have him down in the rankings. Roquan, listen, if you have him, you're starting him. He's healthy. I get that. Just don't expect a 25-point game because unless he gets a strip sack and a return for a touchdown, I just don't see the volume for tackles there this week for Roquan. So start him, but be realistic. Expect the 12, 14 points, not the 24. Moving on, number 9, EJ Speed. Now he's moved down my rankings just because, again, people are off bye weeks. The best of the best is here, and he's going to have a bad matchup this week. But week 13, of course, he was on bye last week versus Indianapolis. Week 13, he had 9 tackles, a tackle for loss, and a pass defense. Yeah, things are looking good. 35 tackles over the last 4 games. That checks out. But he's playing Denver, a bottom 3 matchup. As far as tackles go, to linebackers, only allowing 14.2 on the year. Again, we've got EJ Speed and Zaire Franklin, and you're telling me they're only going to combine for 14.2 tackles? I find that hard to believe. I'd like to think they combine for more than that, but as it is, it's a bad matchup. So I think EJ Speed's his floor is actually going to be hit a lot harder than Zaire Franklin's in this game for some reason. Zaire Franklin seems more like matchup proof in bad matchups. EJ Speed, we've seen like some 3 or 4 tackle games, nothing else, no other stats. So EJ Speed, unless you have somebody who have a strong hunch about, who I'll make a good case for coming up here, or if you have maybe a very thin, shallow league, you might have the ability to have 2 top 5, top 8 options. You don't have to think about it. But EJ Speed's a tough one this week. If you rode him all season, I have him in a league. I'm not benching him. It's a deep IDP league. I don't have any second thoughts about it. But yeah, he's going to play 100% snaps. It doesn't take many drives for EJ Speed to get his points. He still has a safe floor, in my opinion, but his upside is slightly hindered. Number 10, Quay Walker from Green Bay. Quay Walker's looked really good. Last game, 10 tackles with a tackle for loss versus Detroit. Back-to-back games with double-digit 10 tackles. He's on pace to set a new high in tackles. His rookie season was the best year as far as tackles he had with 121. A really impressive year for him. I remember that year. So he's actually on pace to eclipse it. Health being a big part of that, being able to stay healthy. He's had 5 double-digit tackle games. He's going to have it tough in this matchup. He's playing Seattle. Seattle is dead last in tackles given up to linebackers per game with 12.5. Fortunately, last week, if we look at recent history, Kaiser White and Mac Wilson totaled 18 tackles versus Seattle's Zach Charbonnet and company. So, recent history is telling us last week, Kaiser and Mac, they blew that out of the water. It was supposed to be 12.5 tackles per game. They had 18. I mean, now we're looking at Seattle the whole season when we've had Kenneth Walker as the running back. Last week, what did Charbonnet had? 150 yards, 2 touchdowns. Looked like a completely new player. So maybe life in Seattle is different. The matchup is different. This isn't a dead last matchup for whatever reason, because they do have Charbonnet. We'll see if that play continues for Charbonnet this week. But I'm not really looking at this and saying they were dead last up till, for the first 14 weeks. That's where they're going to end up this week. I think the different dynamic of Charbonnet versus Walker really does, shake things up, and that was part of the reason why Kaiser and Mack Wilson were able to have an average of 9 tackles each last week. So Quay Walker, matchup proof. I like this guy a lot. I think as continues getting these double-digit tackle games, as long as Charbonnet starts. If Kenneth Walker starts, then you look at Seattle like who they are. But hopefully he's doubtful. He's not going to play, and we'll get a matchup with Charbonnet instead of Kenneth Walker. So I like, even in a bad matchup, I like Quay Walker a lot here. I also like number 11, Daiyan Henley, who had 8 tackles and a pass defense last week versus Kansas City in a good matchup. Week 15, he's going to go against Tampa Bay. They've allowed 15 and a half, over 15 and a half tackles per game to linebackers their last 3 games. So it's a decent matchup. One big caveat here that we are, looking at, checking out before the game is Bucky Irving going to play in this game? To me, if Bucky Irving plays, this is a lot better of a matchup for Henley. If Bucky Irving's out, sure, Sean Tucker can tote the rock. Number one, he's so fast. Is Henley going to be able? Henley's fast. I mean, if you watch him play, he's quick. So I do think he'll be able to catch Sean Tucker. But Sean Tucker seems like every time that guy touches the ball, it's 20 yards. But I don't know if Tampa Bay is going to run as much if Bucky Irving is out. So keep that in mind. Maybe temper expectations. If the trend is right now, it's looking like he is trending to being out. So Sean Tucker is not as enticing for Henley owners as Bucky Irving is. That's the only caveat there. If Irving starts, Daiyan Henley, we could even maybe make a case to bump him up the rankings. So great play, still in the playoffs. Number 10, going with Josey Jewell here for Carolina. Josey Jewell has been an absolute monster over this last couple games, actually over the last month. The last 3 games he's played, he's had at least a sack. Last game versus Philly in Week 14, a sack and a half. So this guy has shown it is not a fluke. He's done it 3 games in a row, with the tackle output being 9, 10, and 10. So 29 tackles over the last 3 games and a sack over the last 3 games. Incredibly productive when it matters here in playoff time. So start him with confidence. Josey Jewell's just a madman. Keep in mind something that I think even booms his stock. I really haven't had Josey Jewell in this top 15. A big reason why he makes it this week is Trevin Wallace is indeed out. So not that Trevin Wallace was setting the world on fire, but I do think that Josey Jewell will be given all he can handle this week. As long as that hammy stays healthy, Josey Jewell is going to eat. This is still a top 8 matchup versus Dallas. They seem to be toting the rock well. Rico Dowdle has had back-to-back weeks with 100 or more yards, 130 rushing yards last week. So to me, Dallas is limited. They know that. They know, they have Cooper Rush. It's no more Dak. I don't think they come out and, air this ball out. I think they want to take their win, want to beat Carolina. I know they're bad, but they don't want to lose to Carolina. So run the ball, do what's been working with Rico. That's going to make plenty of opportunities here for Josey Jewell to continue putting up double-digit tackle games. So love Josey Jewell. Josey Jewell honestly has the upside of a top 5 linebacker, but with his hamstring injuries, maybe with game flow, we'll see how this game goes. Like there is some potential downside, but I think Josey Jewell, if you have him, and you maybe you're thinking him over somebody really low, like somebody you have a hunt, don't overthink it. Josey Jewell is a great play. He came in the game questionable last week with a hamstring injury. His hamstring still bothering him. He went out and had 10 tackles and a sack and a half. So Josey Jewell, if you have him, if he's in there, just check before the game, make sure he's active, and start him with confidence. Number 13 moved a lot south in my rankings here is Bobby Spillane versus Atlanta this week. Bobby Spillane, 7 tackles last week versus Tampa Bay. Only 32 tackles over the last 4 games. So I know that's an average of 8, which is pretty solid. If we're talking about a waiver pickup in week 8, yeah, linebacker, yeah, that would be pretty solid. But we're talking about the playoffs here. Um, Robert Spillane has had a rough last 3 games as far as tackles go. He's looked out of whack. He started the year with the first 5 games, 10 or more tackles, double-digit tackle outputs. He's had 0 in the last 3. So yeah, pump the brakes on Robert Spillane. He's still Robert Spillane, and that's the reason why he's still in this top 15. But to me, horrible matchup versus Atlanta, only giving up 14, not even 14 and a half tackles to the linebacker position collectively. So this is a bad matchup versus Atlanta. Atlanta gives up a lot to safeties, just not a lot to linebackers. So Robert Spillane, if he wasn't scaring you before, again, always has that high upside. Maybe Atlanta can be up in this game and be running it down Vegas's throat, which is what you're hoping for with Spillane. But there's some downside. There's some volatility to his game, no doubt, which is why he's moving down in the rankings when we got so many other great options here. Let's look at number 14, Jordan Brooks. Jordan Brooks has been a model of consistency for Miami. 9 tackles with a sack. It looked like a box score from Seattle. He's getting back in the sack category, a pass defense versus the Jets. And the biggest caveat was that Jets offense gives like the third worst or the second worst tackles per game to linebackers, and Jordan Brooks still had 9. Week 15, he's going to get Houston. It's a bottom 8 matchup. He's familiar with that. That's what we did last week. We went out and had 9 tackles, right? Bottom 8 matchup. Houston's only giving 15 total tackles to the linebackers in any given matchup. But I think in this case, Jordan Brooks, like he proved last week, he's matchup proof. He's a high-end LB2. He went into Green Bay in a decent matchup, had 9 tackles. He comes to the Jets in a horrible matchup, gets 9 tackles. He's a high-end LB2. And when you look at somebody like Josie Jewell or somebody under him, maybe like a Bobby Wagner, maybe they have a higher upside, but Bobby Wagner we've seen had like 4 or 5 tackle games. Spillane, of course, we have cracks in the foundation. Like Jordan Brooks, to me, if I'm on the fence with one of these 3 guys, maybe just looking at Spillane and Brooks, no doubt it's going to be Brooks. Maybe I'd start Wagner over Brooks, but Jordan Brooks, man, again, getting 8, 9 tackles a game, that's just dependability. Doesn't matter bad matchup, doesn't matter, anything else. He's just playing 100% of snaps and getting his. So Jordan Brooks makes it in this top 15. Number 1, because he's been tremendously productive, especially over the last month. And number 2 is because, again, it's the playoffs. We're not looking for 20 or 0. We're looking for 10 to 15 and, take those good points and bank it. So a good bankability here with Jordan Brooks. And talking about my last guy, I think is going to be pretty bankable this week is Bobby Wagner. And Bobby Wagner, we've seen cracks in the foundation as far as his tackle output. Maybe Father Time is catching up a little bit, but I think Father Time's going to give him a break this week versus New Orleans. New Orleans actually over the last 3 weeks has allowed the absolute most tackles to opposing linebackers, with over 23. Again, number 1 in the league, most tackles allowed to the linebackers over the last 3 weeks. It's the Saints. So to me, Bobby Wagner, we had him as a top 3, top 5 play beginning of the year. He still shows that from time to time. Maybe in a bad matchup, he's somebody who moved down the rankings, but here versus a team that's rolling number 1 over the last 3 weeks. You have no Derek Carr. At least he's doubtful. He's probably not going to play. Jake Hayner is going to be in there. I'm sure Kamara and Kendre Miller are going to get handoffs and screens like no other. So, Bobby Wagner, even though he's lost some luster this year, top 5 matchup for your playoffs this week in Week 15. So, again, if you're looking for honorable mention players, maybe talking about some players who you think you're in a shallow league, you can pick these guys right up. And I got some guys that may be for guys in deeper leagues out there. So, number 1 guy I want to talk about in a great matchup this week versus Philadelphia is Patrick Queen, who's been rolling. Patrick Queen in a good matchup versus Cleveland went and had 10 tackles. He's getting a Philadelphia team who is allowing the 8th most tackle tackles to opposing linebackers. So I think in this Keystone Classic, Patrick Queen maybe not going to have the upside Zack Baun or Nakobe Dean is, but pretty darn good, solid high-end LB2 himself. Next is Micah McFadden. If you're a deep IDP head, you already know the name. You already know that he had 11 tackles and incredibly five tackles for loss versus New Orleans last week. So there you go, Bobby Wagner. There's a little outline of what your week should look like. 11 tackles and 5 tackles for loss. Tremendous stat line. New York, see what happens when you let Bobby O out of the starting lineup and you play Micah McFadden 100% of the snaps. I mean, even if Bobby O was back and McFadden was playing 100% the whole year, I think he would be a lot better for fantasy. Really wasn't the dependable player that we saw before. The snaps were kept in check about 75%. Now we see with no Bobby O, the wings have been taken off. He plays 100%. Looks like an LB1 out there. So already get the news. Bobby Okereke is out again. I really like Micah McFadden in this game where I can't see anything but Baltimore having the ball. That's great for Micah McFadden. I think he has top 15 upside. I'm just not bullish enough to put him on there when we got other great options. But Micah McFadden, great start this week at linebacker. Next is Tyrese Knight. Tyrese Knight had a 12 tackle performance, actually out tackled Ernest Jones. So this is a rookie who's playing an average of 80% of snaps over the last 4 weeks. Seen him get kind of better every week. Last week got the interception. The tackles have been hitting. So yeah, anytime you see a Seattle linebacker that's starting playing close to 100% of snaps, they're probably pretty valuable for IDP. And whether it's Ernest Jones or Tyrese Knight, they're both extremely valuable. And I actually have Tyrese Knight right outside my top 15. That's how bullish I am on him. I have been for a while now and for good reason. So rookies are hungry. Rookies are going to eat. He gets a decent matchup this week versus Green Bay on paper, but I bet you'll see plenty of Josh Jacobs probably get 18 to 20 carries in this game. So I think Tyrese Knight's going to have a pretty dependable week for you this week. And finally, if you're in a very deep league, there might be a good option out there named Darius Misal from the Giants as well. This is the number 2 linebacker next to Micah McFadden now. Darius Misal last week, 76% of snaps. Oh, he gets the Micah McFadden treatment. He still had 8 tackles, 7 solos, 1 assist. Again, he's going to play Baltimore, which I know Baltimore doesn't give up the most tackles for linebackers, but let's keep an eye, put a receipt on it. Fantasy receipt. Send them this. I want to see how many tackles Baltimore gets this week versus how many tackles New York Giants get versus Baltimore. I bet these linebackers are going to eat this week. So Misal, McFadden, love them both this week. We are going to now move over to our last segment, which is the defensive backs. So we are going to go to weekly in DB. In our last segment here, once again, I do these rankings as well as the linebackers. So here's who I have in my top 15 this week. Coming in at number 1, leading defensive backs in tackles on the season, Budda Baker. Number 2, in second place for tackles, Nick Cross. Number 3, I struck out on Quentin Lake. Number 4, Tre'Von Moehrig. Number 5, Xavier McKinney. Number 6, Julian Love. Number 7, Derwin James. 8, Kevin Byard. 9, Taylor Rapp. 10, Brandon Jones. 11, Kyle Duggar. 12, Kyle Hamilton. 13, DeMar Hamlin. 14, Brian Branch. And 15, Xavier Woods. So, number 1, number 2 stays pretty chalk here. Budda Baker, Nick Cross. Number 1, looking at Budda Baker, 18 tackles. Insane. 8 solos and 10 assists with a tackle for loss week 14 versus Seattle, which was a great matchup. Guess what? He gets another great matchup this week versus New England. You want to know what? Nick Cross played New England 2 weeks ago and had 9 tackles and a sack. So, yeah, Nick Cross did well. I expect Budda Baker to, repeat that line. 9, 10 tackles. Maybe not a sack, but anytime you get a defensive back, you can bank on 8 to 10 tackles. You're starting them. These guys aren't even, we don't even have to say anything. Nick Cross, that last game he played. Of course, week 14 was on bye. Last game was week 13 versus New England. I had mentioned 9 tackles and a sack. He is straight up Nick Cross, 5th in the NFL, 2nd for defensive backs to Budda Baker with tackles. Nick Cross has got 125. So both of these guys, I mean, interchangeable, absolute studs. Nick Cross came out of left field. Budda Baker made the resurgence. And for Budda Baker, he's playing New England. New England's given up the second most tackles to the safety position over the last 3 games with almost 20. And he actually leads the safeties and tackles with 132. So Budda Baker, model of consistency. Nick Cross, 1A, 1B type of deal. Quentin Lake let us down big time. 3 tackles, 2 pass defense versus San Francisco. And I had him ranked so high. I mean, San Francisco last week was giving up the absolute most tackles to the safety position. Now they're moving to number 2. So it's still a great matchup. But, I mean, you saw the rain. We didn't expect that. So, a lot of these guys were out of whack. Bosa, even Quentin Lake and Cooper Kupp, no catches. So chalk that one up to the rain. Quentin Lake still played 100% of snaps. So I'm not going to peg him too much next week. We'll see who the matchup is. But Quentin Lake will maybe throw him a little asterisk that game. Number 4, Tre'Von Moehrig. Tre'Von Moehrig kind of made a resurgence. Fell off for a couple weeks. I put him in the dog pound. I was upset with him. But he returned to action. Boy, did he last week. 8 tackles, half a sack, 3 pass defense versus Tampa Bay. This week, he actually even gets a better matchup versus Atlanta, who are giving up the most tackles to the safety position with over 16. So Tre'Von Moehrig, he was in the doghouse, but he's back. He's back inside now, and I have him I'm bullish on him. I have him as a top 5 play. Hopefully, he doesn't go back to his old ways here and let us down. You can call me out if he does, but Tre'Von Moehrig in a juicy matchup, the best matchup you could ask for off a big game. I think he's going to make good this one. Number 5, we're going to look at Xavier McKinney, who had 7 tackles versus Detroit in Week 14. He's had 18 tackles over the last 2, good average of 9 there. So he's been playing really strong. Week 15, he's going to get Seattle, who allow 18 total tackles per game to the safety position over the last 3 games. That checks out. That's a great matchup versus Seattle. I think you'll get a lot of Jaden Reed in this game. Of course, a lot of Josh Jacobs, but I think that this is a good Seattle team, and Green Bay, a good team themselves. I think they want a big NFC pride here, and I think they want to go into Seattle and knock them off. So I think Seattle's going to have to throw the ball, and it's going to be a great game, great matchup for Xavier McKinney. Moving on, we got number 7, Derwin James. Down game last week, 2 tackles, but he did have a sack versus Kansas City in Week 14. He gets a top 12 matchup versus Tampa Bay. Of course, last week, you remember me saying Tre'Von Moehrig versus Tampa Bay had 8 tackles and half a sack. Oh, half a sack. When we talk about safeties and sacks, nobody does it better than Derwin James. So this is a great opportunity. Look, even though he had a down game last week, the last 4 check out. 28 total tackles over the last 4 games, 2.5 sacks, 3 tackles for loss, a pick, 2 pass defense. Derwin's back to doing it all. Maybe the 2 tackle down game was due to like the alignment. I know he's playing some slot corner now, so that's a blessing and a curse. And you know what? When Derwin James plays Kansas City, it's always some monumental. Him bringing down Travis Kelce, slamming him, or doing some kind of big play. That just wasn't the case last week. But I do think it'll be back to his old ways. The Derwin James we know and love this week. So I love Derwin James a lot versus Tampa Bay. I think it's a great top 12 matchup. Number 8, I have Kevin Byard, 5 tackles and a pass defense, Week 14 versus San Francisco. A little bit of a down production there. Of course, I mentioned before San Francisco, the best matchup you could ask for if you're looking for safety tackles. So Kevin Byard only had 5 of them over the last couple games before that. Matchups weren't that good, but the output was. So it was a little bit head-scratching there to see Kevin Byard just with 5 tackles. But the last 4, he's had 37, so an average of almost 8, and also 2 pass defense. So Kevin Byard has been rolling, and the only reason why he's not inside my top 5 like he was last week is because he's getting a bottom bottom 12 or bottom 8 matchup versus Minnesota, who's only giving 11.2 tackles per game. But keep in mind that over the last 3 games, this matchup has not been so bad because we've seen Minnesota give up 15.7 tackles to the safety position over the last 3 games. So actually, it's been, if you look at it the season as a whole, Minnesota's a bad matchup. But like we said, last 3, they've been pretty top notch, pretty juicy matchup. Last week, Jesse Bates had 9 tackles versus Minnesota. So there's the potential's there. Kevin Byard, he's the guy. I like him a lot this week. Just keep in mind the Minnesota matchup. Even though it's been juicy as of late, it hasn't been the whole season. So I'm not going to dive head first, but I still like Kevin Byard. He's going to probably have 10 points at minimum. He's a great vet, great player. So keep him in your lineups. Number 9, I called it last week with a revenge game. Taylor Rapp, 13 tackles. That was like his best production I've ever seen out of him. No coincidence. It was in a revenge game versus the Rams in a good matchup. But yeah, 13 tackles versus the Rams. He gets another top 8 matchup this week versus Detroit. Detroit's allowed 14.2 tackles per game to safeties, so it checks out. It's a great matchup. Last 4 games, Taylor Rapp has been tremendously productive. 32 tackles, so that's good for an average of 8, with 2 picks, 1 forced fumble, and 2 passes defense. Taylor Rapp is questionable right now with a neck and shoulder injury. All you got to do is make sure he's active. If he's active, I can put some money on the table that he's going to be playing 100% of snaps. All you got to do is make sure he's out there and active on Sunday. And if he is, set it and forget it. Take the 10 points. Hope for 20, but expect it to be 10 points. At safety, 10 points is not is not given. It's earned. So this is not a position to mess around with. If you can get somebody that'll give you a 10, take that and win it with your other positions. Moving on here, after Taylor Rapp, number 10 is going to be Brandon Jones. Brandon Jones makes his return from the lineup after an injury. Left week 13 versus Cleveland after playing 56% of snaps and only 3 tackles. Was a little bit of a disappointment, not only because he was injured, but it was supposed to be a good matchup. Played half the game. He only ended with 3 tackles. It was going to be a letdown most likely. But he's going to get a matchup versus Indianapolis, who are trending up. They're allowing 14.3 tackles per game over the last 3. So it's a great matchup as of right now with Anthony Richardson returning. Only one top 10 matchup Brandon Jones has had all year, and that was against Pittsburgh. He had 7 tackles in that game. That sounds like the Brandon Jones we know and love. And actually, he would have had 2 top 10 matchups, but he missed his game versus Atlanta a couple weeks ago. So really, when we look at Brandon Jones as a whole this year, we'd say when he's in the lineup, he's been a starter. He's been tremendously, productive, and that's true. And most of those games, believe it or not, have been in bad matchups. So let's see what he can do in a good matchup. I'm excited for Brandon Jones. I think he's completely past the injury. He practiced full today, and was after being limited all week. So it's a good sign. I think Brandon Jones is, again, pencil him in as a top 10, top 12 safety in a good matchup. Perhaps if it was a bad matchup, I wouldn't have him here, but that is the case. And I expect Denver to probably be up in this game, which means that, Indianapolis has got to throw. Since Richardson's came back, it looked like he has wanted to throw the ball more, make more of a statement that I can throw the ball to, rightfully so. He has a lot to prove there. And I think all that works out in Brandon Jones' favor. So keep rolling with him, even though he has not played in a couple weeks. Maybe he's out on waivers. He might not even be owned. Number 11, Kyle Duggar. Sneaky play here. People kind of forgot about him. He's been out for a while, but hasn't played since week 13. They were on bye last week. But week 13, he did have 8 tackles and a tackle for loss, actually, and a pass defense versus Indianapolis. So, hey, I told you, Brandon Jones, it was a good matchup. Kyle Duggar went out and had 8 tackles against you. Week 15, Kyle Duggar is going to play Arizona, which is a top 8 matchup to safeties as far as tackles go. And they allow 14.2 tackles per game to safeties. Kyle Duggar, expecting him to play in this game. He is listed as questionable. He's been hampering through an ankle injury the last couple weeks. I expect him to play after a layoff of bye week last week. him and Jabril Peppers make for a good pairing there. I'll talk about Jabril Peppers a little bit down the line here. But moving into our number 12 guy, and you see I had Kyle Duggar above Kyle Hamilton at number 12. Kyle Hamilton, 4 tackles, week 13 versus Philly before a bye week last week. That was a bad matchup versus Philly. Maybe we're going to, toss it out. But actually, things get worse matchup-wise this week versus the Giants. Last 2 games, Kyle Hamilton has only combined for 7 tackles combined. That is not looking good. Again, Giants, horrible matchup, only allowing 12 tackles per game to safeties. Can Tim Boyle sustain drives? Again, going back to my question, are they going to be able to stay on the field to give Kyle Hamilton a shot at 5-10 tackles? Is Baltimore going to get up in this game so bad that they rest the starters? Kind of like especially Kyle Hamilton, someone who was hurt a few weeks ago. Maybe they let him rest up. So I do like Kyle Hamilton. Huge upside. Still has that. Maybe he goes out and gets a sack against Tim Boyle. But I just think the opportunities for volume tackling is not going to be there for Kyle Hamilton this week. So trending down the last 2 weeks, he's got a decent matchup on paper, but as a whole in this scenario, if I have Kyle Hamilton, I'm trying not to play him. I think there's a lot of good options. Again, somebody who can give you 20 points, but somebody that can give you 4. So we're really not trying to go there in the playoffs. And maybe if it was a matchup versus Atlanta, different story. A matchup versus the struggling Giants with Tim Boyle at the helm, I really don't want a piece of that. But he is Kyle Hamilton, so I'll respect him and keep him in my top 12. Number 13, Damar Hamlin. Again, take your 8-10 points. Don't try to reach for the stars and fall down off the airplane in the meantime. But Damar Hamlin, he's questionable too, as well as Taylor Rapp. They very well could have neither of them in this game. But I believe as long as they both start, they're both top 15 plays. Kyle Hamilton, as well as Taylor Rapp, had 13 tackles in that crazy game versus the Rams last week. Again, great matchup versus Detroit. Week 15 is a top 10 matchup as far as tackles go to safeties. I'm not really worried about playing time. As long as they're starting, I think they're going to play 100%. I'm not worried about Hamlin being limited because his back's hurting. I just don't see that being the case. The only thing that's going to hurt this play is if they're ruled out inactive, and that would probably mean that Cole Bishop would be the starter. At least if both of these guys are inactive, maybe they're down to like Micah Hyde too. They're really bad. But last week's game versus the Rams was a great game as far as IDP for Hamlin and Taylor Rapp, and entertainment as well. Just watching that game. And I think this game here, Detroit versus Buffalo, is going to be a tremendous game as well. So I think a lot of throwing, a lot of sustained drives. I think Damar Hamlin is going to get you your 10 to 12 points, maybe even more. Number 14, Brian Branch, again in that same Detroit and Buffalo game. Last week versus Green Bay, he let us down again with 3 tackles. Listen, Green Bay is just Brian Branch's kryptonite, back-to-back games with 3 tackles, both duds. When playing Green Bay. So, hey, they played them twice. They're off the schedule now. We are now on to a Buffalo team. We get a slight bump in the matchup here. Buffalo's allowing 12.5 tackles to the safety position, which is a little bit of an upgrade versus last week with Green Bay. Again, Brian Branch, we know his upside. It's tremendous. He has huge upside. But, to say he's a top 3 safety, I think it's just bullish. It's just looking at the upside and having, laser focus on it. I think you need to look at the, games as a whole and say, as much as Brian Branch does have huge upside, he has a very low floor, and that's scary. And that's why he's moved down significantly in my rankings. But again, I'll respect the upside and keep him in my top 15. Finally, at number 15 here, he's been rolling over the last month or so, and that's Xavier Woods. 5 tackles versus Philly in a bad matchup last week. This week he's going to get Dallas, which is actually a slightly worse matchup. So you're looking at me like, Johnny, why are you talking up Xavier Woods? Well, I'll tell you why. Is because I think the dynamic of Tre'Von Wallace being ruled out in this game, I expect Xavier Woods. We know he's somebody as a safety who can play in the box, who can come up and help, defend the run. And I think that's what's going to happen here. We saw when Shaq Thompson went down earlier in the year, Xavier Woods really started his production really started increasing, and I don't think it was coincidental at all. When Tre'Von Wallace, when after Tre'Von Wallace was playing 100% of snaps because Josie Jewell was back, Josie Jewell was out when Josie Jewell returned, Tre'Von Wallace at first was playing about 65%, 66% for 3 or 4 games there. In those 3 or 4 games, Xavier Woods was absolutely cracking off 7, 8, 9 tackle games. So I think that the fact that we're not going to have Tre'Von Wallace this week, we're going to have like Claudin Sherilis. I'm not touching him in fantasy, but I'll tell you what, I think Xavier Woods – games where they're missing a linebacker in Carolina, I think they ask him to help more in the run game. And he can, we've kind of seen him play like a linebacker role from the safety position. So I think that's what we're going to get. I know the matchup is not great. Last week's production is not great. So, maybe a bad storm, but I see light out of this situation because of Tre'Von Wallace being out. And I still am looking at a guy who averages almost 7 tackles a game with 3 picks on the year. So Xavier Woods, call him a safe floor, lower upside, but I do think there's a world of possibilities where he can get you 15, 16 points this week still. So I think, at worst, he's going to have 8 points for you. If you can start him and assuming that the worst is going to be 8 points, then he's a fine play. I think he's going to make well for you this week. So Xavier Woods, keep rolling. And finally, we're the bottom of the top 15. If you are looking for maybe some honorable mentions who I think will be really good plays this week that are not inside this top 15, the first guy I'm looking at, and I'll be honest with you, is right outside my top 15. I'm bullish on this guy. Other rankers don't have him ranked so high, but and I think maybe the fact that is he going to play 100% of snaps? There's somebody who's out. I'll get to in a minute, but Jonathan Owens has just been, wreaking havoc the last 3 games. He's had 23 tackles, an interception, a forced fumble, a fumble recovery, 2 passes defensed since he's been a starter, and that's because Elijah Hicks has been out. So Jaquan Brisker's out. That's when Kevin Byard took over for him. Then we lose Elijah Hicks, and now we see Jonathan Owens. And of course, anywhere Jonathan Owens has been, whether it be Detroit, Houston, like we've seen him be incredibly productive at times, and that's what he's looked like back in this lineup here for Chicago. And I know he gets a bad matchup this week versus Minnesota. That's actually keeping him out of my top 15. That's how high I am on him. But he's got a matchup versus Minnesota this week. We know as a whole this year that's a bad matchup for safeties, but over the last 3, that has actually been a good matchup. So Minnesota, I mean, it makes sense too. Like they have Justin Jefferson, Hawkinson, Sam Darnold's throwing 5 touch. Like why can they not give tackles to safeties? Well, they started, for whatever reason the last 3 weeks. So Jonathan Owens, even in a bad matchup, when he's averaging 8 tackles a game, making these splash plays like we were used to, I think Jonathan Owens, you can do a lot worse than him. So maybe if you don't have a top 15 play, he would be somebody I'm absolutely looking for. So if you're starting a safety who's not on this page and he's not named Jonathan Owens, I would personally recommend you to pick up and start Owens. Some other guys who last name is not Owens, just make sure, going back to Owens, just make sure before the game Elijah Hicks is out. If Elijah Hicks is starting, there might be a mess of playing time being distributed. I'm not even playing Owens at that point if Hicks is active. But if Hicks is out, it's going to be Owens there next to Byard. They're both going to have nice games. Next is Chamari Connor for Kansas City versus Cleveland. We've seen the playing time come up the last couple of weeks. The last 4 games, he's had 28 tackles, an average of 7. Tremendous. 3 tackles for loss, an interception, and a forced fumble. And this is a cornerback we're talking about. They do have Reed. They do have Brian Cook. But Chamari Connor is a corner. Najee Johnson is a popular sleeper. towards the middle of the year. We've seen his playing time go down to the 20%, so take him out of your lineup completely. You can't trust Najee Johnson this week, but you can trust Chamari Connor, who's been on an ascension. So I like him. I don't talk about starting corners often, but I do think Connor is an exception. Next is Amani Hooker from Tennessee. He's got a top 5 matchup versus Cincinnati. 12 tackles and an interception in the last 2 games. Just a high floor, low ceiling guy who, if you're really hurt and you're in a deeper league, I think Amani Hooker this is a good week to use him. Next is Evan Williams. Evan Williams from Green Bay, the rookie. He is playing Seattle. It's a top 8 matchup. He had 7 tackles versus Miami. Jonathan Bullard is out of this game, so it's going to be Evan Williams next to McKinney. Evan Williams has looked productive. He's made splash plays when healthy. That's the big thing with him is last week he had a concussion versus Detroit, missed the whole game, didn't record a stat. So, I mean, Evan Williams, there's some volatility to his game, but if he stays healthy this whole game, he should get you at least 10 points, 5-6 tackles at least, and maybe a splash play in there too. So I like Evan Williams as a sleeper in deeper leagues. And finally, don't forget about him. He might have another big game. He did it the last time he stepped on the field, and that's Jabril Peppers. 10 tackles versus Indianapolis in Week 13. Week 15, he gets Arizona, which is a top 8 matchup. Indianapolis was a fine matchup in itself. We saw Kyle Duggar have 8 tackles in that game. Jabril Peppers outproduced him with 10. So, that was a very productive game by Peppers. I don't know if he's exactly going to get 10 tackles, but he came right out of suspension and boom, resumed, played 100% of snaps and excelled there. So in a great matchup, I think Jabril Peppers out of these two, and keep in mind, Jabril Peppers and Duggar, they're both getting unique usage here that we don't see around the NFL. They're both playing in the box at a high rate. But if you were to ask me to start one of them, I would say I would still start Kyle Duggar a little bit ahead, hence why he's on my top 15 and Jabril Peppers is not. But I'll tell you what, if you're looking for a high upside, if you got nothing to lose and you're looking, to set the record as far as points this week, I think Jabril Peppers, there's a chance that he gets that 8 to 10 tackles. So somebody who might be free out there right now who's not rostered. Hey, it's Week 15. I want to thank you guys, as always, for rocking with me. If you have any questions, you have any comments, leave them in the description. I'll be sure to get back to you. I want to say, again, one more time, thank you very much for viewing and listening to my stuff, for becoming subscribers to the channel. If you have any ideas, you think something I can do better, I'm always up to take that into account. So thank you very much. Best of luck in your playoff matchups this week, and we will see you next week in the semis.
Thank you for watching the IDP Plus YouTube network. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Be sure to tap the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload new content.